He thought he was just following clues. A solo traveler with a camera and a secret, crossing into the most forbidden nation on Earth. But when a single photo gets him arrested for espionage, Ian Holland is thrust into a nightmare of lies, torture, and betrayal. Why did they know his name before he arrived? And why does the one person who can save him, the brother he came to find, now insist he's the enemy? What if the entire trip was never really his idea? The first thing Ian noticed when he arrived in Pyongyang was the silence. Not just the quietness of traffic or the absence of advertisement noise. This was something deeper, an engineered stillness that pressed against the skin like cold glass. He had crossed into North Korea under a special travel visa, one of the few Westerners allowed in under the watchful eye of a state-approved tour group. To anyone else on the trip, he was just another curious American fascinated by an enigmatic country. But beneath his camera lenses and rehearsed politeness, Ian had come with a far more personal reason. Still, he played the role well, taking photos of monuments, nodding at guides, applauding at the choreographed performances. Everything was going fine until the fourth day, when they passed through a rural checkpoint on the way to a mountain village. Their van broke down, an unusual inconvenience in a country where everything shown to foreigners is obsessively choreographed. As the group stood by the roadside, Ian noticed an old, rusting communications tower barely visible through the trees. He wandered a few steps off the path, pretending to adjust his camera. The moment he raised his lens and captured that tower, a structure he had only seen once before in a grainy photo taken by his missing brother, he sealed his fate. Less than 10 minutes later, the group was ushered back into the van, now mysteriously fixed. Ian said nothing about the photo. He didn't notice the extra soldier riding up front. He didn't hear the whispered radio call. But when they reached their hotel, he was pulled aside by a uniformed officer. There was no explanation. No shouting. Just a firm grip on his arm and a single phrase spoken in chillingly calm English. "We know who you are." The next thing he knew, he was blindfolded, his belongings taken, and driven away from the city under cover of night. Ian's mind raced. Had they searched his camera? Had someone seen the photo? Or worse, had they known all along? The room he was thrown into wasn't a cell. It was more like a void, a windowless concrete box with a single flickering bulb. They took his shoes, then his belt, then left him to sit. Hours passed. Then a voice through a speaker. "Why are you here, Mr. Holland?" Not Ian. Mr. Holland. The name on the ID he'd used to book the trip was a pseudonym. He never used his real surname when traveling for sensitive matters. But they said it anyway. As dread curled in his gut, he realized this was no misunderstanding. He hadn't been caught taking a photo, he had walked directly into a trap. Before Ian Holland became the man hunched in a windowless cell in Pyongyang, trembling in his socks and replaying a single camera click in his head like a death sentence, he was just a quiet man with a very loud ghost. He'd grown up in San Francisco in the shadow of his older brother, Mark, a brilliant, rebellious journalist who never met a boundary he wouldn't cross. Where Ian chose computers and quiet corners, Mark chose war zones and dictatorships, hell-bent on exposing truths others were too afraid to touch. Their parents didn't understand Mark's choices, but Ian admired him, even envied the fire that drove him into danger for a higher purpose. For years, Ian followed Mark's bylines, watching from the safe glow of a laptop screen as his brother's name appeared in headlines from Iran, Syria, even Somalia. But then 2 years ago, the headlines stopped. Mark disappeared without a trace near the Chinese border with North Korea after allegedly chasing leads about underground detention camps used to re-educate defectors and dissidents. The last email Ian received from him was just one sentence: "If anything happens, the answer is in the static." The words haunted him. For months, Ian tried every official channel, State Department, embassies, journalists, until the polite responses stopped coming. The world had moved on, but Ian hadn't. A year passed. Then, late one night while combing through encrypted messages on Mark's old backup drive, Ian stumbled on a cluster of images. Blurry stills from what looked like surveillance footage, and one distinct shot of a rusting communications tower with strange markings. The metadata placed it near the North Korean side of the Yalu River. That's when he made his decision. He would go. Not as a brother seeking justice, but as a ghost of a man his brother once inspired, a civilian with nothing left to lose, chasing the invisible thread that might still bind them. Ian crafted the plan meticulously. He applied for a North Korean travel visa through an approved third-party tourism agency based in Beijing, using the alias Ian McAllister and scrubbing his digital trail of any connection to Mark or his media legacy. He trained his face into one of feigned curiosity and calm, the kind tour guides loved because it didn't ask too many questions. He deleted every suspicious file, burned the footage onto a hidden drive tucked behind his phone battery, and uploaded a separate backup to a secure cloud disguised in a private photo album. Every step he took was measured, methodical, and yet deeply desperate. He knew the risks. North Korea didn't just detain foreigners, they sometimes erased them. But what haunted Ian more than that possibility was the silence he'd been living in. No closure. No truth. Just an endless echo of questions no one could answer. If there was even a sliver of a chance that Mark had left breadcrumbs, Ian had to follow. The photo of the tower wasn't just a clue, it was a promise. Mark had known they were watching. He wouldn't have sent Ian a message that vague unless he expected him to decode it, to finish what he started. That belief became Ian's religion. It justified everything, the fake name, the risks, the paranoia. And when he finally arrived in Pyongyang, breathing in that eerie quiet, he told himself it was worth it. He convinced himself he was ready. But reality didn't match imagination. The people were more scripted than he'd expected. Every moment was monitored. The guides, while smiling, were razor-sharp in their control. Ian quickly learned that asking questions, especially about infrastructure or history not pre-approved, drew a certain look. So he played along, even as anxiety gripped his gut with every step toward the tower's location. He thought he'd have more time, more freedom, a better window. Instead, his chance came in the form of a mechanical breakdown, and he jumped at it. One photo. That's all he took. But maybe that was always part of their plan. Now, as he sat in that silent box of a room, replaying every decision, every encrypted file, every thread of Mark's voice in his head, he realized something terrifying. Maybe they hadn't just caught him. Maybe they had waited for him. Because if they knew his real name, then they knew why he was really there. And that meant his brother hadn't just vanished. He had been taken. And Ian had walked straight into the same net. The click of the shutter was so faint that Ian barely registered it through the rustle of wind in the trees. 1 second, he was angling his lens through a gap in the foliage, squinting to focus on the decaying metal structure partially obscured by pine branches. The next, a sharp voice barked his name, not McAllister, but Holland, and time fractured. 2 soldiers emerged from the roadside shadows where no one should have been. Their boots crunched on gravel with an eerie synchronicity as they approached, rifles slung but eyes locked with a predator's precision. Ian froze, still holding the camera as if pretending he wasn't already guilty. One soldier reached forward and snatched it from his grip without a word. The other simply gestured. Ian hesitated for half a breath, then obeyed. The van he'd arrived in was gone. In its place, a drab olive military truck waited idling behind the tree line. Ian was pushed into the back, the canvas flaps falling behind him like theatre curtains sealing a final act. The ride was long. Longer than made sense. There were no questions, no beatings, not yet. Just silence. And in that silence, Ian's heart pounded like a drum of war. His mind sprinted through worst-case scenarios, rationalizations, escape fantasies. Maybe they just wanted to delete the photo. Maybe it wasn't as serious as it felt. But he knew. Deep down, he knew. This wasn't about a photo. This was about him. When they reached the facility, a squat, windowless complex surrounded by cracked concrete and barbed wire, Ian was pulled into a white-tiled room with a single table and a single chair. The kind of place designed to make a man feel erased from the world. Across from him sat a tall man in a stiff military uniform, face unreadable, voice low and deliberate. "Why did you photograph a restricted facility, Mr. Holland?" It wasn't a question, it was an accusation already affirmed. Ian tried to deny it. He said he was a tourist, that it was a mistake, that he didn't know what the tower was. The man didn't blink. Instead, he produced a stack of documents, slid them across the table, and pointed at a signature line. "You admit to espionage." Sign. Ian refused. Again and again. And each time he said no, the lights grew harsher, the voices colder. He was left in the room for hours, days maybe. It became hard to track time without light. They returned with more documents, more questions, new faces. Some were deceptively friendly, others screamed in his face. But the story never changed. They believed he was a spy. Not just a nosy tourist or reckless traveler, but a trained foreign agent on a mission. They cited emails, travel logs, encrypted files they should not have been able to access. One man, clearly fluent in English, leaned in during an interrogation and whispered, "We know about your brother. And we know what he was looking for. Do you?" That broke Ian in a way he hadn't expected. Not because it confirmed his fears, but because it meant Mark had been here. Had made it this far. And they were using that against him. From that point forward, Ian couldn't lie anymore, not convincingly. His voice cracked when he insisted he was innocent. His eyes betrayed too much knowledge. They sensed it. He became less of a puzzle and more of a liability. So they changed tactics. Sleep deprivation. Ice water dumped over his head. Food withheld. A camera on him at all times. In one especially surreal session, they showed him footage of himself, stepping off the plane, laughing during a performance, even brushing his teeth in the hotel. "You are always watched," they said. Always. Ian realized the entire trip had been curated not for tourists, but for him. Every stop, every smile, every delay, was part of a web designed to catch him. He wasn't a man caught in a moment, he was baited, lured into a trap that had been set the moment he booked his ticket. Then came the suitcase. They brought it into the room like it was sacred, unzipped it with theatrical care. Inside were bundles of foreign currency, documents, encrypted hard drives. Not his. He had never seen them before. But they told him this was found in his hotel room. Evidence. Proof of his crimes. They slid the confession form forward again. Sign, and the pain would stop. Sign, and he would go home. Maybe even see his family again. But signing would mean admitting to a lie so big it would rewrite who he was, what Mark had stood for, and why either of them ever came to this place. Ian stared at the paper, veins throbbing behind his eyes, lips cracked and dry. He thought of Mark's voice in that last message. The answer is in the static. He thought of the tower. He thought of his girlfriend, who still believed he was on a regular business trip to Tokyo. Then, he looked up at the guard and, through a mouthful of blood and dust, said, "No, that was the moment something in the air changed. No longer a suspect. Now an enemy." They stopped pretending after that. Gone were the staged smiles and softly worded questions. The moment Ian refused to sign the confession, the performance ended and the real face of his captors emerged. Days bled into each other inside that frozen room where the lights never turned off and the air was always just a few degrees too cold. Sleep became a currency, granted in slivers, stolen without warning. Guards rotated, but the routine remained. Questions, threats, silence, and violence. It wasn't the beatings that broke Ian the fastest. It was the solitude. Hours passed without sound. Then suddenly a voice would crack through the silence. "Where is your handler, Mr. Holland?" Or worse, "Why did your brother fail his mission?" Every word designed to confuse, to disorient, to pry open the cracks in Ian's resolve. They used noise as a weapon. Blasting foreign music at impossible decibels until his ears rang for hours afterward. Once, they strapped him into a chair and played a distorted voice on loop that sounded eerily like Mark's, saying the same 3 words, "He betrayed you." Over and over. Until Ian screamed just to hear a sound that wasn't that. Food arrived in small, tasteless portions. Rice that reeked of something chemical, water that tasted like metal. The only breaks from this monotony were the sessions in the interview room, a sterile chamber with a high-mounted camera and a microphone that clicked just before someone spoke. In one of the more disturbing interrogations, they placed a thick file in front of him. Photos, charts, maps. A timeline of Ian's movements dating back 2 years. Every country he'd visited. Every email he'd sent. Even texts to his girlfriend about Mark. "You see, we don't guess," said the officer, this time without rank or name tag. "We confirm." The implication was clear: they hadn't found Ian by accident. They'd been waiting, watching, and now they wanted a show. A confession. A public statement. Something to parade in their national media that would validate their paranoia and warn others never to come looking for ghosts. Then came the choice. During one session, they brought in a translator, not one of the usual grim-faced men, but a woman. Her voice was soft, eerily maternal. She spoke as if she pitied him. "They can't keep you here forever," she said. "But they need closure. For their people. For their security. Say what they want, and you go home." Ian stared at her. "And if I don't?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Then you disappear. Like your brother." It was the cruelest move they'd made. 4 days afterward, Ian wrestled with the offer. He replayed it over and over: freedom in exchange for fiction. Admit he was a spy. Denounce the West. Confirm their fabricated evidence. Smile for the cameras. And then, maybe they'd release him. Maybe not. He had no way of knowing. But every fiber of his survival instinct screamed at him to consider it. At night, when the cold was bone deep and sleep was impossible, he imagined standing in front of a camera, reciting lines he didn't believe. It sickened him. But it also tempted him. There were moments, brief flashes, when he almost convinced himself it was okay to lie. That surviving was more important than integrity. That Mark wouldn't have wanted him to rot in this tomb of concrete and steel. Then one day, they brought him something new. A tablet. On it, a video clip played, grainy surveillance footage from years earlier. It showed Mark at a checkpoint near the Chinese border, arguing with a soldier. The audio was low, but the panic in his body language was clear. Behind him stood 2 men, hooded and restrained. One of them screamed something muffled as Mark reached for them before he was tackled. The footage ended there. The interrogator said nothing. Just watched Ian's face collapse into silent agony. "He came looking for secrets," the man said. "He found them. And they broke him." The way he said it, past tense, was a knife in Ian's chest. But then something happened that changed everything. In his next session, they allowed Ian to sit at the table without cuffs. There was a microphone. A red light blinking. A single line of instruction: read the statement. The page in front of him was a full confession. Worded in the first person. A carefully crafted propaganda script about American infiltration and Western lies. The camera turned on. The room was silent. Ian looked down at the paper. His hand trembled. But in that moment, something shifted inside him. Not courage, clarity. This wasn't just about escape. This was about truth. If he read this, he would betray not just himself, but his brother's memory. Everything Mark stood for. Everything Ian had crossed a line to find. He let the paper drop to the floor and looked straight into the lens. "My name is Ian Holland. I am not a spy. I am a brother looking for answers in a place that buries them." The red light blinked off. The door opened. He was tackled to the ground. That night, they beat him worse than ever before. But Ian didn't scream. Because in that brutal moment, he understood something fundamental. They were afraid of the truth. Not just his words, but his will. And for the first time, he felt like he had taken something back from them. The next morning began like the rest, with cold water splashed across his face and a guard barking orders he no longer had the strength to resent. Ian had been reduced to a shell of himself, physically weakened but internally sharpened, like a blade that had been ground against stone for too long. He had stopped hoping, stopped speculating, and accepted that the only thing real anymore was the present moment and whatever horror it held. So when the guards blindfolded him and led him not to the interrogation room but through a series of turns and upward stairs, Ian didn't ask questions. He simply followed. He expected another stunt, another scare tactic, maybe even execution. But what he wasn't prepared for, what shattered the foundation of everything he thought he understood, was the face that greeted him when the blindfold came off. He was in a larger room now, concrete but sunlit through a narrow glass slit. A chair sat opposite him, and in it, looking pale, older, but unmistakably familiar, was Mark. For a moment, Ian's breath caught in his throat. His brother was alive. Not a memory, not a ghost, alive. But something was wrong. Mark didn't jump up. He didn't cry or smile or even flinch. He looked at Ian with cool, unreadable eyes. His hands were folded neatly on the table. The Mark Ian remembered would have already cursed, kicked, made a scene. But this man sat like he belonged there. Ian whispered, "Mark." His voice cracked. "Is it really you?" The man across the table nodded once. "Yes," he said in a voice that had the right tone, the right cadence, but none of the fire. "I'm here. But I can't help you, Ian." That sentence knocked the air out of him. "What are you talking about? I came for you. I thought you were dead." Mark cut him off. "I know why you came. But you don't understand. They're not the enemy. They gave me purpose. They saved me." It made no sense. The brother Ian had idolized had spent his life exposing lies and tyranny. Now he was sitting in a North Korean facility, parroting their ideology like a spokesperson. Ian leaned forward, pleading, "Mark, they tortured me. They want me to confess to lies. You can't be one of them. You can't." Mark's face softened for a second. Just a flicker. But it was there. "They tortured me too," he said quietly. "But in time, I saw things clearly. I saw what the West does, how it manipulates. We were blind, Ian. You still are." Ian recoiled, as if struck. This wasn't brainwashing. It was worse. Mark believed it. Or was pretending to. And when the door opened again, the interrogator stepped in, smugly. "Your brother confirms everything," he said. "You see. This is not a betrayal. This is justice." The next phase of Ian's captivity became less about punishment and more about display. They made sure to bring Mark into multiple sessions, as both a witness and a reminder. He would sit silently in the corner, a symbol of submission and loyalty. Ian tried again and again to break through. He asked about their parents, about the hike they took as kids when Mark sprained his ankle and Ian carried him down the trail. He brought up the stories Mark used to write, the promises they made. And once, just once, he saw the mask slip. Mark's hand twitched. His eyes dropped. But then the wall returned, stronger than ever. On the fifth meeting, Ian snapped. "You're not my brother. You're what they made from him." Mark didn't react. But the interrogator smiled and nodded. "Very good. Now we understand each other." Later that night, Ian was dragged into a new room. This one was cleaner. Brighter. Cameras lined the walls. At the center stood a podium. A script sat on it, the same confession from before, but this time labeled, "Statement verified by Mark Holland." Ian stared at the page, rage boiling beneath his skin. They weren't just using Mark, they were using his trust in him. And worse, Mark was allowing it. But something gnawed at Ian's gut. A detail that didn't make sense. In one of the interrogations, Mark had tapped his fingers against the table in a steady rhythm. 3 long taps, 2 short. At first, Ian thought it was a tick. But now, recalling old childhood codes and games, he wondered. That pattern, 3 long, 2 short, was how they used to signal danger when playing spy games as kids. Could it have meant something? The final clue came the next day. A guard handed Ian a slip of paper and said, "Your brother asked that you read this." It was a quote, handwritten in clumsy Korean script. Translated, it read, "The static speaks when the signal fails." Ian's heart pounded. That was not a phrase the regime would choose. It was a variation on Mark's last message. Suddenly, everything twisted. Mark wasn't loyal. He was trapped. And the performance. The coldness. It was survival. Maybe even part of a deeper plan. But if Mark was trying to help, he was doing so at an unimaginable cost. His identity, his beliefs, his soul. The brother Ian had known was still alive, but buried beneath years of manipulation and fear. And Ian's fight wasn't just to escape anymore. It was to bring him back. The air felt different that morning. Thicker somehow, saturated with something unseen but undeniable. Ian had stopped measuring time by hours or days. He measured by bruises, by new scars, by the rising clarity that he would not leave this place unchanged, or at all. But when two guards came without shackles, without guns, and asked him to wash and dress, something shifted. They handed him fresh clothes. Not a prisoner's uniform, but a collared shirt and slacks. Too big, but clean. He'd barely slid into the sleeves before they escorted him down the hall and into a studio-like room with bright lights, multiple cameras, and a long desk adorned with a North Korean flag. Behind it sat a familiar man with slicked-back hair and a manufactured smile, the same state journalist who hosted propaganda segments aired on international media. Ian's pulse quickened. This was it. The broadcast. The show they'd been rehearsing for weeks through pain, silence, and the slow death of truth. Mark was already seated across the table, immaculate in a black suit. He didn't look at Ian, just kept his eyes on the desk like it was a lifeline. The host smiled wide and motioned for Ian to sit. The cameras blinked red. A voice chirped in his earpiece, rehearsed and robotic. "We are now live to viewers across the Korean peninsula. Mr. Ian Holland will address the world." Ian's tongue felt heavy. The script was in front of him, laminated and worded carefully. It painted him as a CIA agent, sent to stir rebellion and corruption from within. It painted Mark as a repentant American journalist who had seen the light and returned to the fold of truth. The plan was simple. Ian would read it, Mark would nod, and North Korea would win its narrative. But as the opening line burned into Ian's vision, something in the room cracked. The host gave a subtle nod. Mark looked up, just for a second, and tapped the table with his knuckles. 3 long, 2 short. Again. The signal. The warning. Ian's hands began to sweat. If he read the script, the nightmare would continue. If he refused, he'd disappear. But if he did something else, if he told the truth here, now, live, he might light a fire no amount of darkness could smother. He looked up at the cameras and spoke. Not from the script. From himself. "My name is Ian Holland. I am not a spy. I came here searching for my brother, who was kidnapped by this regime 2 years ago while trying to uncover human rights abuses. He is sitting across from me, forced to lie to survive. They tortured us. They tried to make us tools in their game." The host froze. The translator panicked, cutting the audio. One of the guards stepped forward. But Mark stood first. With a suddenness that stole everyone's breath, Mark slammed his fist on the table. "He's telling the truth," he shouted. "We were both brought here under lies." The room erupted. The journalist shrieked for the feed to be cut. Guards grabbed Mark, but he resisted, locking eyes with Ian in a final burst of the brother he once was. "Tell the world," he screamed before they dragged him out of frame. Ian lunged for the microphone, knowing the feed might still be rolling to some viewers. "Search the static. The files are in the cloud, album name Signal Lost." Then a blow to his temple sent everything spinning into blackness. When Ian awoke, he was in the back of a van, wrists zip-tied, head pounding. Through the slits in the canvas, he could see trees, snow, and a familiar sign, Yalu River Border, China. They hadn't killed him. Not yet. Maybe the broadcast had complicated things. Maybe someone powerful had decided he wasn't worth the fallout. The van stopped. A guard cut his restraints and tossed him out. No words. No ceremony. Just exile. He stumbled across the checkpoint like a drunken spectre and collapsed into the arms of Chinese border agents. The debriefing was long and cold. Authorities took statements, copies of hidden cloud files, metadata. Some believed him. Others didn't. But when the partial recording of the live broadcast surfaced on a Japanese news network, grainy, bootlegged, but damning, the tide began to shift. The world saw a sliver of the truth. And though the North Korean state denied everything, called it deepfake propaganda, the seed had been planted. Ian was taken back to the US weeks later. Physically free, but chained to nightmares. The files he recovered were authenticated. Some of Mark's early footage, blurry images of prison camps, testimonies from defectors, were verified. But Mark himself was gone again. No word, no signal. Some said he'd been executed. Others believed he was in a deeper hole, unreachable. Ian chose to believe he was alive. Because believing otherwise would unravel the last thread keeping his own mind from collapse. He gave interviews. Wrote a book. advocated for sanctions. But the truth always came at a cost. He couldn't sleep, couldn't walk past a camera without flinching. And every time he opened his cloud storage and saw the album titled Signal Lost, he half expected a new upload, a hidden message from Mark, 3 long taps, too short. The code that meant, "I'm still here. Don't stop." In the end, Ian had found what he came for. Not rescue, not peace, but truth. And the brutal knowledge that sometimes, even when you find it, the world looks the other way.